Okay. All right. Good evening again. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you to those who helped organize. And I hope that this is the beginning of a number of shiurim, of the women's shiurim, which there's been a men's monthly shiur. So we're hoping to start a women's monthly shiur with different speakers. Hopefully that can be an exciting endeavor. And I'm honored to be able to at least give the first one, and we'll take it from there. So our topic tonight is Yehudis or Yehudit, whatever your preference is, the source of a modern day miracle. And I am going to share my screen with you. There we go. Okay. And let's begin. Many of us are familiar with the story, at least on some level, but hopefully we will learn some ramifications and some lessons that maybe haven't been discussed previously. So the first thing that comes up when discussing this topic is the concept of afhein hayu be'oso hanes. Okay, what that means is that the women too were included in the miracle. That's what it literally means. So we'll see what the ramifications of that are. So we know there is a halacha, which is brought in this first source, the Mishnah in Kiddushin, that talks about a few different general principles of when different people are or are not chayiv in specific types of mitzvos. One of those examples in the bold is kol mitzvas aseh shehazman grama, anoshim chayavin v'noshim pturos. That any mitzvah which is zman grama, which is caused by time, literally, men are chayivin and women are pater. So this is what's known. This is the basis for why women are formally not chayiv in a number of mitzvos, because mitzvos aseh shehazman grama. Okay, the details and why that's the case are based off of psukim, and there's a lot of Torah taught about that. That's not going to be our focus tonight, but that is the reality that mitzvos aseh shehazman grama, women are pater from. So what's an example of mitzvah aseh shehazman grama? So the classic example is, let's say, tefillin. Okay, so women, we're not talking, topic is not whether women should or should not wear tefillin, but what's clear is that women are pater from wearing tefillin. And that's true with any time-bound mitzvah, except for when it's not, which is quite often. And there are a number of reasons why that may be the case. We're going to focus on this one concept of afhin hayu be'oso hanes. So the Gemara in Psachim, in the second source, has a statement from Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who writes, Nashim chayavos be'arba kosos halalu, that referring to the Dalet kosos on Pesach, we might think that's only chayav, that's a mitzvah which is specifically during the reading of the Haggadah, which is meant to be before Chatzos. It's clearly a time-bound mitzvah. But yet the Gemara says that women are still obligated in that mitzvah. Why is that the case? Because women also were included in the miracle, and therefore, even though according to the strict letter of the law and the concept of a mitzvah man grama, maybe we would think that women would be pater, they are not because of their role in the miracle. What does that mean? Rashi explains, that it was in the merit of the righteous women of the generation of Mitzrayim that led to the geula, that led to the redemption of Mitzrayim. V'chein gabe mikra Megillah. Similarly, mikra Megillah, the reading of Megillah, that women are chayiv to hear Megillah, even though it's a mitzvah saseh shehazman grama, it's a positive commandment that is time bound. Still, we say they are chayiv. Why? Because the mishum de al yedei Esther nigalu, because they were redeemed. We were redeemed through the hands of Esther. Esther, obviously, very essential role in the geula, and therefore it overcomes even the typical halachic principles. And finally, v'chein gabe ner Chanukah b'Maseches Shabbos, and so too by ner Chanukah. Just to see the Gemara by Megillah inside the next source from Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, we're over here. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Noshim chayavos b'mikra Megillah she'afhin hayu be'oso hanes. Like we said, that women are chayav in mikra Megillah because even they are because they also were included in the miracle, so it supersedes the other principle of mitzvahs aseh shazman grama. And Rashi explains she'af al hanoshim gozar Haman lahashmid laharog ule'abed, that the decree of Haman was not only to destroy men, the decree of Haman was to destroy women as well, women and children and everyone, right? Laharog ule'abed min na'ar v'ad zaken taf v'nashim v'gomer, right? Every Jew, Haman didn't differentiate. Haman wanted to destroy everyone. And therefore, the miracle that was done, that the Jews were saved, included everyone. And so women, even though they would typically be pater for mitzvahs haseh shazman grama, which the Megillah is, in this case, again, would be chayiv. Now, what's interesting is if you notice Rashi, the Rashi in Pesachim over here, when quoting what the miracle was for Purim of Afhein Hayu Ba'oso Hanes, was Mishum De'ayidei Esther Nigalu, was the essential role that Esther played. In the Rashi in Megillah, it's more of a passive role, that they were, right, that the gezerah of Haman was on everyone, on men, women, children, everyone, and because not the women were included passively in that miracle as well, that's also considered Afin Hayu Ba'oso Hanes. Tosfos does go into that a little bit more as to whether Afin Hayu Ba'oso Hanes means an active or a passive role, but for our purposes, there's not a tremendous difference, but it's just an interesting nuance to point out exactly what does it mean in order to be considered the involvement in the miracle. Was it more passive, that the miracle was done to everyone, or was it more of an active role that Ayidei Esther Nigalu, that the active role that Esther played, or Bishum the Nashim Tzidkanu Sheb Oso Hador, as Rashi said. Okay, but either way, the point here is that we see a couple of examples that the miracle, because of the women's involvement in the miracle, whether it's active or passive, but because of the involvement in the miracle, that supersedes this other principle of mitzvahs aseh shehazman grama. And of course, our example, our case, the Gemara in Shabbos writes, Isha vaday madlika, that of course, writes the Gemara, a woman is chayiv in hadlakas neros Chanukah, even though again, in Ner Chanukah is a mitzvahs aseh shehazman grama. It has a specific time in which one can fulfill it, and it's a positive commandment. So therefore, according to the other principles of halacha, perhaps one can say that women should be pater, but no, women are chayiv. Why? Do Amar Yeshua ben Levi nashim chayavos b'ner Chanukah she'afein hayu ba'oso hanes, because they too were included in the miracle. What does that mean? And so we'll get to what that means in just one moment. And that is in fact the way Shulchan Aruch paskins, Isha malek is ner Chanukah she'afi chayeves ba, right, that a woman lights ner Chanukah. Now we're not getting now either into the discussion of a married woman. Should a married woman light a separate menorah or not? Some say that she lights together with her husband, that they only need one, right? And some say no, a woman, even once she's married, should continue to light her own menorah. For sure, from a halachic perspective, she can be the only one lighting the menorah. And there are situations where that comes up very frequently, is that if the husband's coming home late from work, let's say, or if he's out of town, right, then not only does she light her own menorah, she's the only one that lights the menorah. He doesn't even light the menorah. Maybe he should where he is, but again, that's getting a little bit off topic. But clearly, the level of chiyuv is is the exact same for a woman as for a man, despite the other principle, which would have otherwise said that maybe that shouldn't be the case, but because of the role of the women in the miracle, it supersedes that principle. So what exactly was this miracle of Chanukah, and what exactly was this involvement in the miracle? Now, certainly if we say that it only means passively, so we understand the women were saved just as much as the men. So that's what it means, that their role. But if we're going to say that it's a more active role, so what was that more active role? So Rashi already references the story that we are familiar with. The Rashi in Shabbos writes, Hayu ba'oso hanes, shagazru yevanim, al kol besulos hanesuos, v'hibatel atasur tchila. So a little bit of background here. There's a Gemara in Ksubis. It's a lengthy Gemara, and in depth that I didn't bring it here. But the Gemara in Ksubos talks about what day of the week they used to get married on, and there's complicated factors in what went into that. But in the context of the Gemara acknowledges that there were times in history that where the Jews were living, there was a decree by the government that a woman, before she would get married and before she would be able to be together with her husband, she would have to first have to have relations with the one of the government officials, either the mayor or the governor, whoever it is. But that was the case. So says Rashi, that was the case in the time of Chanukah. And the miracle came about through the role of a woman who we know as Yehudis or Yehudit. And the Ran, in his comments on the Rif, goes into a little bit more detail, and he writes, that's what we referred to. Good. The Amrina ben Medrash, who was this woman? The Bito Shel Yochanan ha'echila lerosh ha'oivim, right? That the daughter of Yochanan Kohen Gadol. Who was that? So Yochanan Kohen Gadol was the father of all of the Maccabim, right? Yehuda Maccabee, all the Maccabim. The father was Yochanan Kohen Gadol. So this woman, who still is nameless, but we know is Yehudis, she was the daughter of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, the sister of the Maccabim. So what happened? So she understood what the decree was at the time, and she had the courage to use that as a means of saving the Jewish people. How so? She invited the head general over and fooled him that she was going to entice him, and she instead gave him cheese and wine, right, to get him drunk. And she chopped off his head, and then, as the Kolbo says in the next short source, she took it to Yerushalayim, and she showed all the Yevanim, ubarchu kulam, they all ran away, and that is the miracle of Yehudis. So what we see is that Yehudis had a very active role, right? She had a very active role in terms of the miracle. Obviously, this is not talking about the Nes Pach HaShemen, but this is talking about the miracle of the war in which she played a major fundamental role. And therefore, because of that role, right, that's considered Afhein Hayu Ba'oso Hanes, and therefore it supersedes the other principle of Mitzvah Saseshes Man Grama, and therefore women are Chayiv in Hadlakas Neros Chanukah. So what's clear is the role of Afhein Hayu Ba'oso Hanes, of the role of Yehudis, and that role is the impetus to overcome this other principle of Mitzvah Saseshes Man Grama, and that because of that, women have an equal obligation in Ner Chanukah as men do, and despite the other principle of Mitzvah Saseshes Man Grama. However, that's not the only thing that comes out of the story of Yehudis. Additional minhagim, additional customs and focus on women for the holiday of Chanukah come from other aspects of this. The same source I just quoted you, I didn't read the last line, that was intentional, so I'm not going to read through the whole sources again, but if you look at the end of both the source of the Ran on the Rif and the Kolbo, these two sources right here at the end, the Alzen Nohagu Le'echol Gvino B'Chanukah. So, and similarly, the Alkein Nohagu Lasos Tavshil Shal Gvino B'Chanukah. Okay, so both the Ran and the Kolbo, and quoted in the Ramah and Shulchan Aruch, all quote that there is a practice based off of that, not only that that women are chayiv in Hadlakas Ner Chanukah, but also that there is a practice, there's a custom to eat dairy, to eat cheesy dishes on Chanukah. I think that's probably where my kids have gotten very into Uncle Moishi recently, and he has a song, we've been listening to the Chanukah playlist, and there's a song about donuts. And there's some line in there about like cheesy donuts. And at first I was like, why is there a line like donuts with cheese? That's not really a thing. And I'm like, oh, okay, it's a cute way of incorporating this minhag. So Uncle Moshe teaches us a lot. But what we see is that there is this custom to also have dairy foods. We all know dairy on Shavuos, but it's not just Shavuos, it's also Chanukah. There is a custom to specifically consume dairy foods and cheese in particular, because that was a big part of the miracle of that Yehudit performed on Chanukah. So that's an additional custom. Now, there's also a custom which you may be familiar with that is specifically in regards to women, although we will see that this may be true for men also. There are those that suggest this for men also. It's not generally assumed to be the way, but that there's a practice, particularly for women, not to perform melacha, okay, during at least we'll call it the first half hour. Okay, we're not going to go into all the sources of how long and what the melachos are. Okay, most assume that doesn't mean like a Isra Malacha the way there is on Shabbos. It doesn't mean that one can't turn on and off a light, right? It means typically it is assumed to mean more strenuous malachos, okay? But there is nonetheless a practice to cut back from the typical work which we may otherwise do, or not we, I'm not a woman, but which women may otherwise do, right? Not to perform malacha. Now, where does that come from? So probably if I asked you, you would say, oh, because of that same thing. So we'll see that may be true, but that may not be true. So the Kolbo, okay, the Kolbo who above mentioned the miracle and the episode of Yehudis and mentioned that is a source of A, why women are chayiv in menorah, and B, why there's a practice to eat dairy on Chanukah. But he says, okay, there's also a practice for women not to perform melacha during the time of Hadlakas Neros. Because of Harav Asher, the Rosh, and Nohagu Hanoshim, Shalola Asos Melacha, Mishas Hadlaka Ad Shas Kiviyasan. That there is a practice for women not to perform melacha during the time of candle lighting. Why? V'nir hatam lehakir she'asr lehistamish la'aron. So one is, he says, because it's a reminder that we're not meant to get benefit from the light of the candles, and therefore we refrain from melacha. Ve'od shema yichbe haner she'yishtamshu kinegdo. If one does a lot of work by candles, again, they didn't have electricity, but there's a concern that we may that by doing work near the candles, we may end up in a situation where we use the candles for light and get benefit of the light, which of course we are not meant to do. So the Kolbo is quoting the Rush that the reasoning has nothing to do with the miracle. It is purely either a reminder or a practical piece. There are those, by the way, who say, based off of these reasons, that it should apply to men also. But certainly that's one approach given. The Tur quotes this, brings this lehalacha. He writes here, my Chanukah, what is Chanukah? And he talks about that, right, the Kafei B'Kislev, that there's 8 days of Chanukah, not to give hespedim, all the different things that we're not supposed to do. And then he writes, towards the bottom here, he writes, Aval mutar hein ba'asiyas melacha, right? There's no prohibition of melacha. It's very hard, by the way, to explain to children. My son, who's 4, like when we were getting excited for Chanukah, he's like, can I watch on Chanukah? Because he knows he can't watch on Shabbos, can't watch on Yom Tov. So I'm like, yeah, it's not that type of Yom Tov. So it's a little bit hard to explain to kids, but it is a Yom Tov, but it is a Yom Tov which is mutter b'melacha. But then he does write, Noah goes, Hanoshim shalo la'asos melacha ba'od shehaneres dolkos, and quoting this practice that women not perform melacha while the candles are still lit. Why? So the Beis Yosef explains and quotes the reasoning of the Rush. Tamon kedei sheyehilam hekera she'asur lishtamish la'aron. Again, that there's a heker that it's meant as a reminder not to use the lights. Not to use to get benefit from the light. And the Shulchan Aruch, in fact, paskins v'noagos hanashim shelo lasos malacha be'ot shaneros dokos, not to, right, that women have this custom not to perform malacha. Why? But now the Magen Avraham, one of the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, shifts gears, and he writes, Dafka nashim, specifically women. Why? Lefi shena'asa nes al yedehem, because the miracle was performed through them, right? Referring to, of course, the story of Yehudit. So while it's interesting that some from the Rishonim all the way down through at least the Beis Yosef, right, don't make any mention of any connection with the miracle, but the Magen Avraham does in fact say that the purpose is because of, that the reasoning is because of the miracle, which makes, again, it's a little bit easier to understand the difference then between why it would be specific to women if it's because of the miracle. If it's given the previous reasons, it's a little harder to understand why that would be the case, that it would specifically be a practice that only the women took upon themselves. But the Taz goes with, like the Magen Avraham, that the reasoning for not performing the malacha while the candles are lit is similar. It is because of the miracle, and in fact, he compares it to Rosh Chodesh, that women have also a practice that we know that the Yom Tov, the time of Rosh Chodesh, was a time which was quote unquote given to, which actually I didn't even think about this when I planned it, but it's Rosh Chodesh tonight, so how perfect, right? So this is like the night of the women, because it's Rosh Chodesh, it's Chanukah, the two Yom Tovim which were essentially given to women, and there's an extra emphasis on the role of women on these holidays. So I'm glad that it worked out this way. So the Taz writes that it's similar to Rosh Chodesh. Why were women given Rosh Chodesh? Because they did not have an active role in the Egel Hazav, in the golden calf. They didn't give their jewelry to the Egel Hazav. The men were the sinners. So because of that, Rosh Chodesh was given to the women, and in fact, that's why there might even be a practice for women not to perform some melacha on Rosh Chodesh. But he writes, Hu hadin b'Chanukah. So too with Chanukah, since the miracle was done through the hands of the women of Yehudis, it is appropriate, it's a nice thing to do, that they have adopted this custom not to perform melacha. But for men, for sure, he writes, there's no such minhag, probably because they did not have this role in the miracle. This is, by the way the Mishnah Berurah understands it as well, because what we saw earlier in the Shulchan Aruch, back up here, that the Shulchan Aruch writes that there's a minhag not to perform melacha while the candles are lit, but he doesn't give the reasoning, even though he did give the reason in the Beis Yosef that it was just as a reminder not to get benefit from the light. The Mishnah Berurah explains why women, and he says that the reasoning why there's a minhag not to do melacha for women during the time of the candles are burning, for the first half hour, we'll call it, right? For the reasoning of the miracle, as the Ramah writes in the next seif, in the next section, what is in reference to what we saw, where the Ramah writes the minhag the minhag to eat cheese and to eat dairy. So it's puzzling why the Mishnah Berurah shifts there, and why the Shulchan Aruch did not put them together, right? Why is Shulchan Aruch in Sif Aleph is saying, there's a minhag not to perform melacha, that's its own thing, and then only afterwards in the next sif, after it talks about whether there's a mitzvah to have a meal, and by the way, because of the miracle, there's a custom to have cheese. But it makes sense because seemingly the Shulchan Aruch, which was written by Rav Yosef Karo, who also wrote the Beis Yosef, okay? So the Beis Yosef was a more extended version, and the Shulchan Aruch was a more concise version of the Beis Yosef. So he himself, Rav Yosef Karo, seemingly held he didn't make any mention by the prohibition of doing the malacha anything to do with the miracle. He said it's because of a reminder, right? So that seemingly is why the Shulchan Aruch splits those up in that way. But the Mishnah Berurah says no. Like the Magen Avraham said, like the Taz said, that it's because of the miracle. At the end of the day, I'm not sure if there's what we would call a nafkamin. I'm not sure if there's really a difference, halachically speaking or practically speaking. But it's an interesting question of where that custom of women not performing malacha developed from. Okay, this is the sif base that I just referred to. Yesh omrim sheish lechol gevina b'Chanukah, because of the miracle. That's what the Mishnah Berurah made reference to. And then here he just, in the next source, he just spells out what we already said. What the miracle was of course by the hands of Yehudit. Now, and the Aruch HaShulchan also is in the camp that the reason why there's a minhag not to do malacha is also because the miracle was done al yedei isha, was done by the hands of the woman of Yehudit. So he's in that camp also. So we see different camps as to where the source of that minhag came from. But nonetheless, at least according to many and some, right, the Magen Avraham, the Taz, the Mishnah Berurah, the Aruch HaShulchan, all of them are assuming that that this practice developed, this minhag developed for women to refrain from malacha during the time of candlelighting, that developed because of this miracle of Yehudit. There is one last place where it may impact, where this miracle may have a practical point in halacha for women on Chanukah, and that is the question of halal. Because halal itself, women are often putter from. What that means is they are not obligated per se, though Ashkenazim for sure hold that if a woman ever wants to, even when she's not chayiv on any Yom Tov, wants to recite Hallel, certainly is allowed to make a bracha, and that's the approach, at least for Ashkenazim. But Tosfos suggests that perhaps Chanukah is different, because where we know that a woman is chayiv in Hallel is, as we mentioned, Dalet Kosos, right? So Tosfos says, Mash Makan de Isha Ptur mi Hallel disrokas. He learns out from the Gemara in Sukkah that a woman is potter from Hallel on Sukkot, v'chein de Atzeres, and also on I'm not sure if he's referring to Shmini Atzeres or Shavuos there. Actually, I have to look back in the context, but either way, he's saying that okay. So on other Yom Tovim, a woman is potter from Hallel. The Taima, why? What's the reasoning? Mishum de mitzvah shehazman gramahi, because Hallel is a mitzvah shehazman grama. Afagav de behalel de lele psachim, even though when it comes to Hallel of Leil Pesach, the Gemara implies that they are chayiv by Dalet Kosos. Umistama lo tiknu Dalet Kosos elikadei lomar leim Hallel ve'agada. An essential part, and this is a whole other discussion, but an essential part and a necessary part of the fulfilling the mitzvah of Dalet Kosos, of the 4 cups of wine on Leil Pesach, is to say it together with the Haggadah, right? It's not just, I cannot just sit down the night of Pesach, drink 4 cups of wine, not make any mention of the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, and think I fulfill my obligation. That's not the case. The mitzvah of Dalet Kosos is to be said upon the Haggadah, one part of which is Hallel. And therefore, he says Tosfos, it implies that women would be chayiv for Hallel there. So he explains, no, shiny Hallel de Pesach, it's different. Why? The al hanes ba, the afhin hayu ba also hanes, right? And that's how he explains that women have an obligation to recite Hallel, even though on most Yom Tovim, women do not have a formal obligation because it's a mitzvah aseh shehazman grama. But on Leil Pesach there is an obligation, and there are those who want to extend that to say that is true in Chanukah as well. Because of the mitzvah of Afhein Hayu Ba'osones, in fact, the most essential part of Chanukah, of the Yom Tov, of the celebration of Chanukah, is they kavum l'shana acheres, as days, right, that Chazal made after the miracles that occurred during the time of Chanukah, Chazal established the 8 days of Chanukah as as days of Yom Tov, as days of celebration, and particularly of Halal v'Hoda'ah. That's the most essential part of Chanukah, is Halal v'Hoda'ah, is praising and thanking God for the miracles and for everything in our lives. And therefore, there are some who want to suggest that women may actually have a more formal chiyuv of halal on Chanukah as well, because it's a fundamentally different type of halal than other Yomim Tovim. So in terms of what was the miracle, right? The miracle was the miracle of Yehudit, right? Who played this active role, slaughtering the Greek army, the Greek general, and showing the Greek army his head and scaring them all off. And that was done by means of cheese and wine. And thus there is so that is number one, that is the reason why, even though according to other halachic principles of mitzvah seisha azman groma, we may think that women should be exempt. No, because of that role of Yehudis, women have a formal chiyuv of Ner Chanukah, despite the fact that it is a mitzvah seisha azman groma. Number two, that's the source for a practice of achilas gevina, of eating cheese, of eating dairy foods on the days and nights of Chanukah. And also, at least according to some, that's the source of the minhag for women refraining from performing at least some melachos, some types of work, during the first half hour of the burning of the candles of Chanukah. Finally, because of the one additional minhag that or ramification that comes out of the story of Yehudis is in terms of halal, whether or not, again, certainly women should and are allowed and encouraged to say halal even with a brachas, at least for Ashkenazim. But some suggest that there's even a greater level of obligation, of formal chiyuv of halal for women because of the role of Yehudis in the miracle. Now, what's interesting is that there are those, Rav Yaakov Emden, who it's not recorded here, but the Aruch HaShulchan is recorded here, and he says same thing. Rav Yaakov Emden was opposed to really learning much from Yehudis on Chanukah, because he actually suggests that the story of Yehudis did not occur Chanukah time. He writes that it did not occur during the Maccabean revolt, but rather he writes that it took place during the time of Chorban Bayis Rishon, and therefore he suggests that there is nothing to commemorate. Okay, that is one opposition he actually opposed to the factual reality of when the story of Yehudis took place. Was it really in regards to the Greek general? Was it otherwise? That's the approach. That's actually what Yaakov Emden writes. And we see it here in the Aruch HaShulchan as well. He quotes that there is a practice, right, not that for women not to perform melacha, and that there's a practice of having cheese and dairy dishes. And then he writes, there are some who were careful to eat cheese on Chanukah, even though he says it didn't actually occur during the time of Chanukah. Aval, fine. So he makes reference to that. Right? Rav Yaakov didn't believe that as well. So that's again, there's much debate and much to be said about that. But clearly, the Aruch HaShulchan says, even though that might be true, the custom has become to adopt and to recognize that during the time of Chanukah. But there's a historical question as to whether the story of Yehudis actually took place Bisman Nes Chanukah or not. So that's opposition number one. Opposition is, number one, is that should we be basing any Chanukah practices off Yehudis? Again, this is not the mainstream opinion. Clearly, the mainstream opinion is that it seems that it happened during the time of the Nes Chanukah, and we've adopted numerous minhagim based off of that. But I thought it was a fascinating idea to at least share that it's not so clear cut. The second piece of opposition is that there are those who wanted to extend this custom of not performing melacha to an entire day, or at least, right? That's what the Aruch HaShulchan writes. all day not to do malacha. Yesh omrim levatel minhagam, to say no, do not allow such a practice. The yesh omrim shelo levatel, and some say no, you can allow such a practice. The yesh omrim de'om rishon ve'acharon in levatel, and then the Magen Avram, he quotes, says compromise for 6 out of the 8 days. Don't allow them to not perform malacha for those 6 days, but for the first and last days, those are more significant, or for whatever reasons. That's a compromise. In the first and last day, maybe prohibit all of malachos, right? And that's similar. It sounds familiar, like by other Yom Tovim, by Pesach, by Sukkot, right? The first and last day. But otherwise, do not allow that. Why not? Says the Aruch HaShulchan, lo shamanu minhagim elu. We haven't heard of such things. V'nashi didon rak be'es hadlach ein osos malacha. That the custom, says the Aruch HaShulchan, of women in our times is at most is only to not perform malacha during that time, either during the time of candles. Again, either as some form of reminder or as a commemoration of this miracle. Why do we not encourage added refraining from malacha? So the Mishnah Berurah explains, quotes that the Shiltei Giburim, who writes here, in a place where the custom is that women do not perform malacha all day, yesh limchos biyadam, should protest, ki habatala averahi umevia lidei shirmum, because not performing malacha, sitting around doing nothing, right? Which is, I'm sure, what we'd be left with, right? But not being involved in malacha and being active, working, that doesn't mean profession working, but performing labor and work, that leads to batol, it's an avera, and brings to destruction. He uses very, very strong words. That's actually based on the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that talks about that. Right? If every day was Shabbos in our world, we wouldn't get much done, and we wouldn't end up doing good things. Right? It's good to be busy, as we say, and that's the idea. So therefore, it's important that women take that the allotted time of Hadlakas Neros to commemorate and to recognize this miracle and the unique role that women played in the miracle, but not to extend that too much. That's the idea. So I wanted to share, just to close, some lighter thoughts, and that is what we see is the role of Yehudis, and it's not only Yehudis. It was also, as we mentioned, in the time of Pesach, the Geula from Mitzrayim, the active role of the Nashim Tzidkanios, that the women took the courage to continue having children and to continue to bring the Geula about, and of course Esther by Megillah. And we see it in many places of Geula, that the Nashim Tzidkanios were the ones who really propelled Klal Yisrael forward. And so it's worthwhile on this time of Chanukah, and tonight, Chanukah and Rosh Chodesh, right? The zechuyos of not involving and not partaking in the terrible sin of the Egel HaZahav was the impetus for women to be given the holiday of Rosh Chodesh. There is the Shulchan Aruch rules that in terms of where to light the menorah, it should be, if it can't be lit outside, the ideal place would be next to the door, right? Many of us are familiar with the window, because for us, sometimes that's more practical in terms of safety and in terms of Pirsumei Nisa. But really, Shulchan Aruch says that one should do it next to the door on the opposite side of the mezuzah. So classically, it's because so that we should be surrounded with mitzvahs. So Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, Zatzal, explained that what is it about menorah? If we want to be surrounded by mitzvahs, right? So we can do many things on the opposite side of the door, right? We can daven on the other side of the door. We can eat our Shabbos meal on the other side of the door. We can take lulav on the other side of the door. There's many things that we can do. So what's the emphasis of menorah? So he explains that the opening of our home and the place of the door between the outside and the inside represents obviously what we allow in and what we take out. And he explains that what the Greeks wanted to do, we know that the Greeks, there were 3 mitzvahs in addition to trying to eradicate Talmud Torah and eradicate the Jewish people. There were 3 mitzvahs that the Greeks said we cannot do. What were those 3? Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, and Bris Milah. Okay, and what they wanted, by the way, as a side note, the Baal Shem Tov says that Shabbos, that if we look at the word chalav, milk, right, and we referenced milk in the context of Yehudit, and that there's a custom to have dairy foods. So chalav, so the ches is Rosh Chodesh, right? The lamed is Milah, and the beis is Shabbos. So the ches is the first letter in Chodesh. The lamed is the beis is the second letter in Shabbos, and the lamed is the third letter in Milah. So the Baal Shem Tov says, so we see that in the zechus of the chalav, the milk of Yehudis, there we were able to maintain the mitzvos of chalav, of Rosh Chodesh, Milah, and Shabbos. So just a fascinating thought. So what Rabbi Dr. Lamb explains is that that the Greeks wanted to dictate not only what we do outside, but what we do in our homes as well. They didn't want us to let us keep Shabbos. They didn't want us to, right? So they wanted to dictate and to make us like them, to eradicate any difference spiritually and religiously between us and them. And so what the mezuzah represents is okay, I'm now entering into my home. I need to maintain that sanctity within my home. I need to be careful and conscious about what I allow in my home. But the menorah actually has the opposite connotation. The menorah is the mitzvah of persuming nisa, of publicizing the miracle. Show the world, right? That's the whole concept of menorah. And so there are things in which we also, when we go outside of our door, it's on the right, and we want to bring that identity with us outside, and being able to balance, he says, what the mezuzah on the one hand, when you enter in, and the menorah on the other hand, right? We want to be able to balance what we allow in our homes and what we take out of our homes. And that, he says, is ultimately who is, based off who do Chazal describe as the primary person responsible for the values instilled within our home. That's, as we know, that women are called the akeres habayis, the foundation of our homes. We all know if men were in charge, we would be in trouble. So right, so the akeres habayis, and that means in terms of the values that we allow and the hashkafos that we allow into our homes, right, are really up mostly to the women. And so therefore, it's appropriate that menorah, which represents this balance of what we allow in and what we allow out, is meant to be focused on by the women on this day, on this Yom Tiv, on this holiday of Chanukah, which has such a strong focus on women and the miracle and the active role in which the women and Yehudis in particular played. And I want to share one final thing, because this is particularly relevant to our day and age and our current situation. And that is, of course, that we need now this courage which women have had through generations, right? And every time of Geula, right, comes by means of the women. If you look at it, it's very interesting, right? We have the words ani mamin, I believe. So I believe the Emunah Shalema that Mashiach is going to come. It's looking towards the Geula. What are the first letters? Ani mamin, Aleph, Mem. Mother, the women. And if you look at every time of Geula, that's what it's come through. If you look at Geulas Mitzrayim, who did the Geula? Who were the leaders? Were Aaron and Moshe. Aleph, Mem, in reference to the women involved. By Purim, Esther and Mordechai. Aleph, Mem. By the Geula to come, it's going to come through Eliyahu and Melech HaMashiach, Aleph Mem, and of course Ani Mamin. And so it's this courage which is so integral and which is so a part of who the Nashim Tzidkani, the women in our people, through all of history, through all of Jewish history, and through our times now, that what the women as the Akeres Habayis, as the hashkafos that we allow into our homes, and the way in which the values that we have and the courage that are instilled in our people, the active and heroic role of women. And that is found through all of these Yom Tovim, through all of these times of the miracles coming about through Yehudit, through Esther, right, through the Nashim Tzidkanios, and Mir Hashem, that the Geula Ha'asida, the future Geula, is going to be based off of this courage and commitment of the women in our community, in our people today. And that's going to be the Aleph Mem, that brings Mir Hashem, the Geula very quickly, the Meher B'Yameinu. And I very much appreciate everyone tuning in, and have a good Chodesh and a Freilich and Chanukah. And I am happy to take any questions afterwards, because I want to let everyone go. So feel free to follow up with me if you have any questions or comments, but have a wonderful night. And thank you for tuning in, everyone.